The year is 1931, and the sun over Sunflower County, Mississippi, rises not with warmth, but with warning. Dawn settles across fields of cotton that stretch like a pale, exhausted ocean. Land worked by black hands, owned by white men who believe Jim Crow is not a law, but a divine order. In this place, the air itself seems to remember every cruelty it has carried. Dust clings to the skin, the heat presses against the lungs, and silence is a language shaped by fear. This is a world where a black man must bow his head to survive, and where a black woman must learn to live in the space between danger and dignity. In this world walks Sarah Whitfield, a young widow whose quiet resilience rivals any monument carved in stone. Since losing her husband, Elijah, she has carried the weight of the land alone, tending the fields, raising their 2 children, and navigating a society designed to keep her small. Yet each morning, as she ties her headscarf and steps into the rows of cotton, she moves with a kind of reverent defiance. She knows the rules of the South like scripture: walk softly, speak little, trust no one. But beneath her calm exterior is a fire she keeps hidden, a fire that Jim Crow has tried to smother for generations. Beyond Sarah's doorstep, the world is shifting. Whispers of resistance rise in church pews, train depots, and the cramped cabins of sharecroppers. The Great Migration is pulling families north, but Sarah stays rooted in the Delta soil, not out of surrender but out of remembrance. Elijah worked this land, he bled for it, and though the laws around her insist she has no rights worth defending, she carries within her a devotion etched deeper than fear. In a landscape where justice is a rumor and hope is an act of rebellion, Sarah's story begins like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, silent, heavy, and inevitable. The evening settled over Sunflower County with a heaviness that felt almost deliberate, as though the sky itself weighed down the world beneath it. Sarah moved through her small home with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to read danger in the shifts of wind and the creak of settling wood. The lantern flame fluttered weakly, its glow barely holding back the dark that pressed against the windows. Outside, the Mississippi night stretched wide and watchful, filled with the brittle song of insects and the distant murmur of the river. Sarah's children lay asleep on their straw mattress, unaware of the invisible lines that divided safety from peril. In this land, after sunset, even the shadows had loyalties, and none of them were hers. She paused at the window, her fingers resting lightly on the sill as she scanned the dirt road that wound past the cotton fields. It was a simple road, worn by wagons and footsteps, but it carried stories that no one spoke aloud. Stories of men who disappeared after sundown, of homes charred to silence, of whispers carried by riders wearing white that glowed faintly in the moon's indifferent light. Sarah had heard them all, though she never repeated them. Fear, she'd learned, traveled faster when given a voice. Tonight, the road seemed unusually still, its surface pale beneath the rising harvest moon. Yet something in the air stirred uneasily, like a warning threaded into the cool breeze drifting through the cracks in the wooden walls. She turned back toward the table where Elijah's Bible rested, its spine cracked from years of prayer whispered over it. Sarah touched it out of habit, as if the worn leather could steady her pulse. She remembered Elijah's laughter, the deep, warm sound that once filled the house, and the way it had vanished from Sunflower County, as if it had never belonged there. His absence was a hollow that nothing could fill, a silence louder than grief itself. But grief had sharpened her, carved her into someone the night could not easily swallow. As she stood in the dim glow of the fading lantern, she felt the stirrings of that old steel inside her, the kind that came from knowing the world did not grant mercy to people like her. If she wanted protection, she would have to become it. The night deepened with a strange, breathless quiet, the kind that made even the insects falter in their song. Sarah felt it before she heard anything, a shift in the air, a tightening of the world around her, as though the land itself braced for something unwelcome. She moved softly across the floorboards, each step measured, each breath deliberate. Her hand brushed the wall, feeling the familiar grooves Elijah carved years before, small marks of a life built with tenderness in a place that showed little. A shiver crept along her spine, not from the cool air, but from the unmistakable sense that she was no longer alone in the darkness, that unseen eyes had settled upon her home like a shadow with intent. Then came the distant hum of tires rolling over gravel, faint at first, as if the night tried to swallow the sound before it reached her, but it grew louder, heavier, until the vibration ran through the floor and up her legs. Sarah's heart thudded once, hard, before steadying into a rhythm she recognized, the rhythm of survival. She blew out the lantern, and darkness wrapped around her like a cloak. Through the thin curtain she saw two beams of light carve through the cotton fields, floating dust, glittering like cold embers in their wake. The car slowed, crawling along the road, as though savoring the moment, its engine purring with the confidence of men who believed the world bowed before their cruelty. Sarah did not move. She simply waited, breath locked inside her chest. The car stopped just beyond her fence, its headlights fixed on the small cabin as if daring it to breathe. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. The night held still, suspended between dread and revelation. Then the engine cut abruptly, plunging the fields back into a darkness thick enough to feel against the skin. Sarah's pulse echoed in her ears, steady but sharp, like a drum warning of an approaching storm. She stepped back from the window, keeping low, her hand drifting toward the corner where Elijah's shotgun rested. She had prayed she would never need it, prayed that dignity and silence would shield her. But Jim Crow's laws offered no shelter, only a script of intimidation written on every black life. As the quiet outside stretched thin, Sarah felt her breath deepen, her resolve harden. Whatever waited beyond her door, she would face it standing. The silence outside twisted into something living, curling around the house like a predator circling its prey. Sarah crouched low, her breath thin and controlled, listening to every shift of the night. The wooden walls, usually familiar and comforting, now felt fragile, too thin to hold back the kind of men who traveled the back roads after dark. She could hear them inside the car, the scrape of a match, the faint murmur of voices, the rustle of movement that carried arrogance more than intent. Each sound pressed against her ribs, each second stretching into a taut thread ready to snap. The moon cast a pale wash across the floorboards, illuminating the edges of her home with a cold, indifferent glow, and Sarah felt the weight of the world narrow into that single moment between. Danger approaching and danger arriving. A door creaked open, slow and deliberate, as though the man stepping out wanted his presence to fill the air long before his feet touched the ground. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots echoed with a terrible clarity, cutting through the stillness like a warning bell. Sarah edged closer to the window, her eyes barely above the sill, and saw him, a tall figure stepping from the shadows, the burnt orange glow of his cigarette revealing the harsh angles of his face. Smoke curled around him like a serpent, lit in brief flashes that showed the cruel smirk of someone who believed himself untouchable. He said something low to the men still inside the car, and their laughter rolled out into the night, a sound dripping with certainty, with the expectation that the darkness would shield their sins. Sarah's hands tightened until her knuckles paled, the familiar burn of fear settling deep in her gut. As he took another step toward the house, Sarah felt the trembling of her own heartbeat transform into something steadier, sharper, not courage exactly, but a refusal to break. The children slept behind her, unaware that terror stood only yards away, and the thought struck her with the force of a wave. She could not afford hesitation. She reached for the shotgun resting against the kitchen doorframe, its wooden stock smooth beneath her calloused fingers. She had seen Elijah carry it into the fields at dawn, cradling it with the same quiet reverence he held for his family. Now it was her turn to carry that burden. The man outside paused near the fence, lifting his cigarette as if offering a mock salute to the sleeping house. Sarah whispered a single warning to her own pulse, steady, and braced herself for what the night demanded of her. The man at the fence dropped his cigarette to the dirt and crushed it beneath his boot, the ember fading like a dying star. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands resting on his hips, surveying the small cabin as though deciding which part of it he would break first. The moonlight caught the edge of his jaw, revealing the confidence of someone who had never been told no, never been made to answer for the terror he delivered under the cover of night. Sarah watched him with a stillness that felt carved from stone, her body poised between fear and defiance. The air in the cabin thickened, every breath tasting like the memory of smoke, as if the house could already sense the danger pressing against its walls. Then came the second sound, another car door slamming shut, followed by low, muffled voices. More silhouettes emerged, their shapes shifting through the shadows like wraiths drawn from the darkest corners of the delta. Their footsteps moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm, the rhythm of men who believed the night belonged to them. Sarah placed her free hand on the floor, feeling its faint vibrations as the men approached. The boards beneath her fingertips whispered reminders of Elijah's hands building this home, plank by plank, dreaming of safety that Jim Crow never intended for them. She felt a sting behind her eyes, not from fear, but from the cruelty of how fragile a dream could be in a land designed to crush it. One of the men tapped lightly on the wooden door, the sound deceptively polite, like a serpent brushing its scales against the threshold before striking. "Evening, Miss Whitfield," he called, his voice smooth and venomous. "We just came by for a word." Sarah recognized the cadence immediately. Harlan Brewer, the plantation owner who had once spoken to her husband as though Elijah's dignity were a debt that needed collecting. That familiarity settled into her bones, heavy and cold. She tightened her grip on the shotgun, feeling the weight of every injustice that had led to this moment. Her breath drew slow, steady, each inhale strengthening her. "Resolve," she whispered a silent message, to the walls, to the floor, to Elijah's memory. "Not tonight, not my children." And as the tapping on the door shifted into a more insistent pounding, Sarah stood ready, her heart becoming an unbreakable drum. The pounding on the door grew harsher, the wood shuddering beneath each blow, as though the very house flinched. Sarah felt the vibrations travel up through the floorboards into her legs, a reminder that the thin barrier between her family and the men outside was weakening. The fire in the hearth flickered uneasily, its glow trembling across the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that made the room seem smaller with every passing second. Ruth stirred on the mattress, her small body curling inward as if sensing her mother's fear. Sarah's breath steadied into a low, deliberate rhythm. She could not afford panic, not now, not when every sound, every movement might mean the difference between life and loss. Outside, the voices grew louder, the men's confidence swelling with each unanswered demand. "Open this door, woman!" Harlan Brewer barked, his tones stripped of the feigned courtesy he wore in public spaces. He slammed his fist against the wood again, rattling the latch. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, hearing in his voice the same authority that had stolen Elijah from her, not with a rope or a bullet, but with the quiet violence of a world designed to suffocate black dignity. The room felt colder now, as though the night itself seeped through the thin cracks in the cabin. She tightened her grip on the shotgun, feeling its weight anchor her. Each second stretched long and sharp, carrying memories she had tried to bury. Elijah's limp hands, the sheriff's indifferent shrug, the whispering neighbors afraid to meet her eyes. All of it rose inside her like a tide, transforming fear into something far more dangerous. Resolve. Then came the voice of another man, rougher, closer, dripping with mockery. "We know you're in there. Don't make us drag you out like the last one." The words slithered into the air, poisoning it. Sarah's pulse hammered, but her gaze hardened. Behind her, the children shifted in their sleep, innocence slumbering inches from hatred's reach. She stepped back from the door just enough to brace her stance, the shotgun held steady against her shoulder. The room seemed to inhale with her, the walls tightening as if preparing to bear witness. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged low, steady, sharpened by the weight of motherhood and grief. "This door won't open," she said, each word shaped with iron. "Not for you, not tonight." The silence that followed trembled with disbelief. A black woman denying white men in the dead of night. And in that silence, the men outside seemed to realize they were no longer the only ones capable of striking fear. The next blow against the door came not from a fist, but from a boot, a violent kick that made the entire frame tremble. Dust drifted from the rafters, the old wood groaning under the assault. Sarah stepped back, her breath sharp but controlled, the shotgun held close to her body as if it were an extension of her pulse. The firelight flickered wildly, casting frantic shapes across the floor, as though even the flames sensed the nearness of destruction. Outside, the men muttered to one another, their frustration mounting, their arrogance cracking at the edges. Sarah heard the scrape of something being dragged across the ground, a sound she knew all too well from whispered stories. A can of kerosene, the precursor to fire, meant not to warn, but to erase. The sharp, bitter smell seeped through the cracks in the door before she saw the glint of the torch. It slithered into the room like a prophecy, curling into her lungs, tightening around her ribs. The men outside laughed, the ugly kind of laughter that had no humor, only cruelty. "Should have opened when we asked," one sneered, voice muffled by the wooden barrier. Sarah backed away, her eyes fixed on the bottom of the door, where the first drop of oil seeped inward, staining the floor dark. She felt her heartbeat thundering through her chest, but beneath the fear was a deeper, older force, the instinct to protect, born of generations who had survived the unspeakable and taught their daughters to do the same. Her children stirred behind her, Ruth's small hand brushing her mother's leg as though instinctively seeking safety. She lowered herself to the floor beside them, her voice gentle even as terror clawed at her throat. "Listen to me," she whispered, brushing Daniel's cheek with a trembling thumb. "If I say run, you run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me." Their eyes, wide with confusion and fear, reflected the trembling firelight. Sarah pulled back the edge of the rug, revealing the trapdoor Elijah had built years ago, a secret he had once joked would never be needed. Tonight, it was salvation carved into the earth. As the door above them rattled under another furious kick, Sarah guided her children into the darkness below, pressing a kiss to each forehead with the desperate tenderness of a mother preparing her heart for war. She rose slowly, the shotgun steady in her hands, and whispered to the empty room, "Come if you dare." The roar of the flames outside rose like a living creature, licking at the porch boards and casting a hellish glow through the cracks in the door. Sarah stood alone now in the center of the small room, her figure framed by firelight that danced along the walls like restless spirits. Smoke seeped in thin grey lines beneath the doorframe, then thickened, swirling upward in slow coils that stung her eyes and clawed at her lungs. She blinked hard, forcing her vision to steady. Each breath felt sharper, the air hot enough to scrape her throat raw, but she did not waver. This house had been built with love, with sweat, with hope, and if the night demanded its destruction, then it would go down with her standing tall inside it. The first torch struck the door with a hollow thud, rolling into the room in a burst of orange flame that spread hungrily across the floor. The heat surged forward in a wave, devouring the air. Sarah lifted the shotgun, her hands steady despite the tremor running through her body. Through the smoke, she saw a figure step into the doorway, a hooded silhouette against the blaze, torch raised like a crown of fire. His movements carried the arrogant calm of a man certain of victory, a man who believed she had already been reduced to ash in his mind. She pulled the trigger. The sound exploded through the cabin, shattering the moment with a thunderous crack that shook even the flames. The man collapsed instantly, his torch tumbling from his hand and setting the curtains aflame in a terrifying rush of heat and light. Chaos erupted outside. Shouts rang through the night, sharp and panicked, men stumbling over one another as Sarah reloaded with swift, practiced motions born of desperation. Another shadow lurched across the window. She fired again, the recoil jolting through her shoulder, the scream outside silenced by the shot. Smoke filled the room entirely now, turning every breath into a battle, every blink into a sting of fire. Her lungs burned, her eyes watered, yet she pressed on, feet planted, like roots in scorched earth. The blaze surged upward, devouring the ceiling beams, sending sparks raining down like vengeful stars. She knew the house was dying around her, but she also knew something else. The men outside, for all their power and their hatred, were running. The night that began with terror now trembled with their fear. The flames clawed their way up the walls, turning the cabin into a furnace that groaned under its own burning weight. Sarah coughed hard, her breath slicing like broken glass as she staggered toward the back of the room. The heat pressed against her skin in waves, blistering, relentless, pulling sweat from her body faster than she could wipe it away. Through the swirling smoke, she could barely make out the doorway, or what remained of it, sagging under the fire's hungry advance. The roof crackled overhead, the sound sharp and frantic, as if the house itself cried out in warning. Yet beneath the chaos, beneath the roar and the collapse and the suffocating heat, Sarah clung to one truth. Her children were alive, hidden beneath the floor, praying in the dark, and as long as they breathed, she could not surrender. She stumbled to the rug covering the trapdoor, falling to her knees as her vision wavered between the glowing embers and the black void below. "Babies!" she rasped, her voice barely more than a whisper smothered by smoke. She pulled the rug back, letting a rush of air pour into the hidden space. For a terrifying moment, nothing moved. Then two small hands reached upward, trembling and soot-streaked. Sarah gripped them with a strength she didn't know she still possessed, pulling Daniel up first, then Ruth, each child coughing, eyes wide with terror mirrored in the flickering inferno around them. The children clung to her, burying their faces in her scorched dress. She pressed her forehead against theirs for a single heartbeat, taking in the warmth of their skin, the rise of their breath, the living proof that love had outlasted rage. She wrapped a blanket around them and rose, staggering toward the back door as another beam collapsed behind her with a loud splitting crack. Sparks showered the room, each one a burning ember of finality. She shoved the door open with her shoulder, letting the cool night air rush in like salvation. Outside, the yard glowed with embers drifting through the darkness, floating like ghosts above the smoldering ruin. Sarah pushed the children toward the old pecan tree, its branches stretching over them like a guardian's embrace. She collapsed beside them, dragging in a breath so sharp it cut her chest, then clutched Elijah's Bible, singed but whole, against her heart. Behind her, the cabin that had once held her laughter, her grief, her dreams, finally gave way with a thunderous crash, sending a pillar of sparks roaring into the Mississippi night. She did not cry. Instead, she held her children close and whispered, "The fire can take the house, but it will never take us." By dawn, the ruins smoldered like the last breath of a dying beast, sending thin ribbons of smoke curling into the gray Mississippi sky. Sarah sat beneath the old pecan tree with her children curled against her sides, their small bodies warm, despite the chill settling over the fields. Her hands were blistered, her eyes raw, her lungs aching from the smoke she had breathed, but she remained upright, a solitary figure, carved from exhaustion and resolve. The rising sun washed the land in pale gold, illuminating the charred skeleton of her home. What had once held her memories now lay in blackened fragments, each piece a reminder of the night's violence. Yet, in the quiet that followed, Sarah felt something unexpected blooming through the ashes. Not despair, but a fierce, trembling gratitude that her children's hearts still beat against her ribs. The soft crunch of footsteps on the dirt road pulled her from her thoughts. She lifted her gaze to see Martha Lewis approaching, her worn skirt fluttering in the morning breeze, her eyes shining with grief and unspoken questions. The older woman carried a bucket of water and a blanket, her breath catching as she took in the destruction. "Lord, have mercy," Martha whispered, dropping to her knees beside Sarah. The water sloshed against the bucket's rim as she reached for Sarah's blistered hands, her own trembling as though the pain were hers to bear. Behind her, the world seemed to hush, the birds, the wind, even the distant hum of waking farms, all pausing to acknowledge the wreckage that hatred had carved into the earth. Sarah met her neighbor's eyes, her voice cracked but steady as she murmured, "They came for us, but we're still here." As the morning wore on, others arrived, quiet, cautious, moving as if entering sacred ground. Men and women from up the road, from the church, from neighboring fields gathered at the edge of the ruins, their faces lined with sorrow and trembling indignation. No one needed to ask what had happened. The ashes spoke clearly enough. They brought food, blankets, tools, small offerings of comfort in the face of a wound too deep for words. Together they formed a circle around Sarah and her children, their presence a silent fortress of protection. As Sarah watched them begin to sift through the debris, clearing the charred boards piece by piece, she felt a shift settle in her bones. What the men in the night had meant as a message of terror had become a spark of unity, igniting something they had long tried to extinguish. Sarah rose slowly, her body aching, and whispered to the trembling morning air, "We're not running. Not now. Not ever." By the second day, the story had traveled farther than the smoke ever could. Whispers drifted through cotton rows and across church pews, carried by trembling voices that spoke of a widow who had stood against the night and refused to fall. In town, some spoke her name with awe, others with fear, but all spoke it. Sarah felt the weight of those whispers as she worked beside her neighbors, clearing the remains of her home. Each charred plank they lifted released a faint puff of ash that swirled upward like dark snow, settling against their skin, reminding them of what had been lost and what had survived. Her children stayed close, their small hands gathering fragments of unburned wood, as though rebuilding something sacred with each piece they held. The air was thick with sorrow, but beneath it throbbed a pulse of rising defiance. That afternoon, the sharp clatter of hooves shattered the fragile calm. The sheriff rode up with 2 deputies, their horses stirring the dust into small storms that rolled across the yard. He dismounted slowly, his face a mask carved from disdain, his eyes cold as river stones. Sarah felt the crowd shift behind her, their bodies forming an instinctive shield. The sheriff surveyed the ruins with a long, calculating stare before turning his gaze on her. "There's talk you shot 2 white men," he said, his voice smooth but edged like a blade. The accusation hung in the thick air, poisonous and deliberate. Sarah stood tall, her blistered hands clasped at her waist. "Men came to burn my children alive," she replied, voice steady. "I sent them back the fire they brought." A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Not fear, but agreement. A truth spoken with no apology. The sheriff's jaw tightened, betrayal flickering in his expression, not betrayal of justice, but of power slipping from his grasp. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the soft dirt. "Watch yourself," he growled. "A woman like you can disappear and no one will ask why." But even as he spat those words, he glanced nervously at the people behind her. Men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on him with a quiet strength he hadn't expected. The deputies shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in the air. After a long, heavy moment, the sheriff mounted his horse again, the saddle creaking like an old warning. Without another word, he turned and rode away, dust curling behind him like a fading threat. When he disappeared down the road, Martha Lewis stepped forward and pressed a hand to Sarah's shoulder. "They'll come again," she murmured. Sarah nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then they'll find us standing." As the week wore on, the nights regained their heavy stillness, but the silence no longer felt empty. It pulsed with the memory of fire and the echo of refusal. Sarah slept little, her body weary, but her spirit sharpened by the knowledge that danger did not end simply because daylight had returned. Each evening, she sat by the window of the small shack Martha had offered, Elijah's shotgun resting across her lap, her eyes tracing the dark line of the road where hatred had once crept toward her home. Fear still lived in her, but it no longer ruled her. It had been reshaped into vigilance, into a quiet readiness born from surviving the unthinkable. Ruth and Daniel slept nearby, their breath soft, their innocence a fragile light she guarded, with the ferocity of a storm gathering its strength. Word reached her that the clan had met again, their pride wounded, their rage fed by whispers of their humiliating retreat. Some said the men who died that night were sons of well-connected families, young men praised in daylight and feared in darkness. Those families wanted revenge, wanted their sons' names cleared and their shame buried beneath another black grave. But others, black families from miles around, came to Sarah's door offering more than condolences. They brought lumber, nails, quilts, and food. They brought prayers spoken softly but with conviction. They brought hands ready to rebuild not just a cabin, but a stand. Together, they raised a new structure, smaller but stronger, its beams thick, its foundations sturdy, its walls hammered into place by those who had long been denied the opportunity to build anything that belonged to them. Every strike of the hammer sounded like a vow. As the sun dipped low one evening, casting the fields in amber haze, Sarah stepped outside the new cabin and watched her children chase each other beneath the pecan tree. Their laughter rose into the air like a fragile hymn, the kind that could break a heart and mend it in the same breath. She leaned against the doorway, exhaustion settling deep into her bones, but beneath it was something else, a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a quiet flame that refused to die. She looked down the road, where twilight stretched like a curtain hiding what approached. "You know where I live," she whispered to the wind, not in arrogance, but in truth. "If you come again, you'll find more than a woman waiting." Her words drifted into the darkening fields, carried by the same wind that had once carried smoke. And far beyond the tree line, a lantern flickered, then vanished, a reminder that the night still watched and the battle was not over. Close to midnight, the sound arrived like a memory returning to haunt the land, the slow, deliberate rhythm of hooves striking the dirt road. Sarah rose before the echo fully reached her porch, the air tightening around her as though the night held its breath. The shotgun lay across her lap, familiar now, its weight steadying rather than frightening. Through the window she saw the mist curling across the fields, rising like smoke from an invisible fire. Then the silhouettes emerged, 6 riders in pale robes, moving like specters through the veil of fog. They carried no torches this time, no roaring fire to announce their cruelty. They came cloaked in silence, convinced that stealth would grant them victory where flame had failed. But Sarah's fear had long since ripened into something stronger, a mother's unyielding certainty that the living would not surrender to the shadows. The horses halted at her gate, one man dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp soil as he stepped forward. "Sarah Whitfield," he called, his voice hoarse, stripped of ceremony. "You've stirred trouble. Time to pay the price." He raised a rifle, the glint of metal catching what little light the moon offered. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, her fingers traced the edge of the lantern she had filled hours earlier, the oil inside sloshing softly. She whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for clarity, and lifted the lantern high. The man took another step toward her, confidence swelling. Sarah hurled the lantern through the open window. It shattered against the ground near the riders, erupting into a snake of fire that writhed across the wet grass, illuminating terror in their hidden faces. The horses reared, the men cursed, and confusion detonated in their ranks. Sarah fired once, then again, each shot a thunderous declaration that she was no longer prey. The flames cut the yard into a blazing barrier, turning the mist into a trembling veil of gold and shadow. The riders scrambled, no longer the executioners of the night, but the frightened remnants of their own cruelty. Some fled into the trees, others stumbled back onto their horses, their robes flickering like dying ghosts in the firelight. Sarah stepped into the doorway, her figure outlined by the blaze, her voice ringing clear above the crackling flames. "You came for a woman," she shouted, "but you've met a mother." The words struck the air like iron on an anvil, final, unshakable. The last rider vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the forest's indifferent silence. And when the night grew still again, Sarah lowered the shotgun, feeling the weight of her strength settle into her bones. Behind her, Ruth and Daniel watched with wide eyes, witnessing not just survival, but transformation.